Kill her before she finishes translating. That was the order Richard Coleman gave, standing 3 feet from a dying man's chair, while Anthony Moretti bled through a $3,000 suit and begged in a language none of his own men could understand. Nobody in that room moved to save him. Nobody, except a 28-year-old waitress who wasn't even supposed to be in that private dining room, who heard her dead grandfather's dialect pouring out of a Mafia boss's mouth, and who, in that single unthinkable moment, became the only person standing between Anthony Moretti and the men who wanted him gone. Before we go further, if this story is already pulling you in, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The private dining room at Sorrento's had always been the safest place in Chicago. No cameras, no outsiders, no mistakes. That was the rule Anthony Moretti had lived by for 20 years, and it was a rule that had never once failed him. Until tonight. He staggered through the heavy oak doors with one hand pressed against his side, blood soaking through the fabric of a $3,000 suit, his breathing sharp and uneven. The 3 men already seated at the long table shot up from their chairs so fast that one of them knocked his wine glass onto the floor, the crystal shattering against the marble. "Anthony!" Marco Russo was the first to move, rushing toward him, catching him just before his knees buckled. "Who did this? Who did this to you?" Anthony didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. The words that came out of his mouth weren't English. They weren't even the Italian the men around that table had heard him speak for years. They were older, rougher, a dialect buried so deep in his childhood that most people in that room had never even known he carried it. "Cosa dice?" one of the men whispered. "What is he saying?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Richard Coleman stood a few feet back from the chaos, his hands folded in front of him, his face arranged into something that looked, at first glance, like concern. He was a city councilman, respected, photographed, trusted by half of Chicago's elite. But his eyes weren't moving the way a frightened man's eyes move. They were calm, watching, measuring. "We need a doctor," Coleman said smoothly. "Someone call his people." "His people didn't do this," Marco snapped, lowering Anthony into a chair, pressing a cloth napkin hard against the wound. "Somebody set him up." Anthony's hand shot out and grabbed Marco's wrist so tightly that Marco winced. He said something again in that same broken, desperate dialect, his eyes wide, urgent, terrified in a way none of them had ever seen him look before. "I don't understand you," Marco said, his voice cracking. "Anthony, I don't understand what you're saying." That was the moment the door to the kitchen swung open and a tired young woman in a black apron stepped out carrying a tray of untouched bread, ready to clear a table she assumed was simply having a slow, quiet dinner. Emily Carter stopped mid-step. She had worked the dinner shift at Sorrento's for almost 3 years, and in that time she had learned exactly 2 things about the private dining room. First, you never entered without knocking. Second, you never, ever asked questions about who was inside. But she wasn't thinking about rules anymore. She was staring at a bleeding man surrounded by 3 terrified strangers, and she was hearing words that made the tray in her hands begin to shake, because she understood every single one of them. No, she whispered under her breath, so quietly that no one else heard it. "Grandpa." It was the dialect her grandfather used to speak in the kitchen of their small apartment when she was a little girl, back when he'd get so angry at the evening news or so overwhelmed with grief remembering his own mother that plain Italian wasn't enough anymore, and he'd slip into something older, rawer, a language from a mountain village that barely existed on any map. She hadn't heard another living person speak it in 11 years, not since the funeral. "Somebody help him get to a hospital," Coleman said, already turning toward the door, already trying to leave. "I'll make the call from outside." "Wait," Emily said. Every head in the room turned toward her at once. Marco's face twisted with something close to panic. "Get out of here. This isn't your business. Go back to the kitchen." "He's asking for water," Emily said, ignoring him completely, her eyes fixed on Anthony. "And he's saying someone poisoned the wine before the shooting. He's saying it wasn't just a gun." The room went dead silent. Anthony's head turned slowly toward her, blood loss making his vision swim. But even through the haze of pain, something in him sharpened, focused, locked onto her voice like a drowning man grabbing onto the only piece of driftwood in the ocean. Tu parli come mia madre, he rasped. You speak like my mother. Emily's hands were trembling now, the tray forgotten, sliding out of her grip and clattering onto a nearby table. My grandfather was from a village outside Enna, she said quietly. He talked like you when he was scared, or angry, or— Say something else, Marco demanded, stepping toward her, suspicion flooding his face. Prove it. Prove you're not one of them. Marco, Anthony croaked, his hand rising weakly in the air, a command even in his weakened state. Basta. Enough. Marco froze instantly. 20 years of loyalty didn't disappear just because a man was bleeding on a chair. If Anthony said stop, everyone stopped. Coleman, still hovering near the door, cleared his throat. We're wasting time. He needs a hospital, not a translator. Anthony's eyes cut toward him, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face that had nothing to do with pain, something colder, something that looked almost like recognition. He said one more sentence in the dialect, low, sharp, urgent, his fingers digging into Emily's wrist as she knelt beside him without even realizing she'd moved. Emily's face went pale. What did he say? Marco demanded. She looked up slowly, and when she spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. He says don't trust the man by the door. He says the man by the door knew before anyone pulled the trigger. Every eye in the room turned to Richard Coleman. For one long, suffocating moment, nobody moved. Coleman's jaw tightened. His hand, which had been resting casually near his jacket pocket, went still. That's insane, Coleman said, forcing a laugh that landed flat in the silence. The man's delirious from blood loss. You're going to take the word of a waitress who's making up a fairy tale in a dead language nobody can verify? I can verify it, came a voice from the doorway. An older man stepped into the room, one Emily had seen before only from a distance, refilling water glasses at tables she wasn't allowed near. His name, she would later learn, was Giuseppe, Anthony's driver for over 15 years, a man who had grown up 2 towns over from the same region Anthony's family came from. Giuseppe looked at Emily first, studying her face carefully, and then looked at Anthony. Lei dice la verità, Giuseppe said quietly. She's telling the truth. Coleman's expression cracked for just a heartbeat, a flash of something raw and furious beneath the polished politician's mask, before he smoothed it back into calm concern. This is absurd, he said, backing toward the door. I came here tonight to help. I'm leaving before I get blamed for something I had nothing to do with. Nobody said you did anything, Marco said slowly, his eyes narrowing, the pieces beginning to click together in his mind, even as his loyalty to logic warred with 20 years of trusting the wrong instincts. Why are you so eager to run? Coleman didn't answer. He simply turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, quick, controlled, deliberate. Nobody stopped him, not yet. Emily's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her own ears. This wasn't her world. She wasn't supposed to know these people's names, let alone understand the secrets bleeding out of a dying man's mouth in a language that belonged to her grandfather, to her childhood, to a life she'd left behind in a small apartment that smelled like garlic and old photographs. But Anthony's grip on her wrist hadn't loosened. Non andare, he whispered. Don't go. I'm not going anywhere, she heard herself say, and she meant it, even though every rational part of her brain was screaming that she needed to run in the opposite direction as fast as her legs would carry her. Marco knelt down on Anthony's other side, pressing harder against the wound, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. We can't call an ambulance. If word gets out he's hurt, if the wrong people find out he's weak, it won't just be him in danger. It'll be all of us. Then what do we do? One of the other men asked, his voice shaking. We move him, Marco said. Now, before Coleman decides to make a phone call of his own. Emily's stomach dropped. Move him where? Somewhere quiet, Marco said, looking at her with an expression that was no longer suspicious, but calculating in a different way now. And you're coming with us. What? No, I have a shift. He won't let go of your hand, Marco said flatly, nodding toward Anthony's white-knuckled grip on her wrist. "And right now, you're the only person on this earth who can understand a word he's saying. So unless you want him to die in the back of a car because nobody can figure out what he needs, you're coming." Emily looked down at Anthony's face. Up close, stripped of the reputation that made grown men flinch at the sound of his name, he looked terrifyingly human, pale, sweating, afraid in a way power was never supposed to allow a man like him to be afraid. "Please," he said, this time in broken English, forcing the word out like it cost him everything he had left. "Please." She had $37 in her apron pocket, rent due in 4 days, and absolutely no reason in the world to risk her life for a man she'd never met before tonight. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll help." They moved fast after that, faster than Emily thought was possible for a group of men trying to carry a bleeding body without drawing attention. Giuseppe brought the car around to the service entrance while Marco and one of the other men, a quiet, broad-shouldered figure named Tommy, half-carried, half-dragged Anthony through the kitchen, past stunned line cooks who knew better than to say a single word about what they were seeing. Emily followed close behind, her apron still tied around her waist, her mind spinning through 100 different versions of how badly this could go wrong. "Where's Coleman?" Marco barked at Tommy as they reached the back door. "Gone. His car pulled out 2 minutes ago." Marco cursed under his breath. "He's going to make calls. We need to move." The night air hit Emily like a slap, cold and sharp against her flushed skin. The alley behind Sorrento's smelled like garbage and rain, and somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, though whether it had anything to do with them, she had no way of knowing. "Get in," Marco said, practically shoving her into the back seat of a black sedan beside Anthony. The second the door shut, Anthony's hand found hers again, gripping tighter than before, his breathing ragged, uneven, his eyes fluttering as blood loss threatened to pull him under. "Stay with me," Emily said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded, even as her hands shook. "Hey, look at me. Stay with me." His eyes opened, just barely, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Perché mi aiuti?" he whispered. "Why are you helping me?" Emily swallowed hard. "Because nobody else in that room was going to." The car lurched forward, tires screeching against wet pavement, and for the first time in her entire life, Emily Carter understood what it felt like to step off a cliff she could never climb back up from. Marco twisted around from the front seat, his eyes hard, studying her like she was a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. "You understand what you just did, right? You just made yourself a target. I didn't ask to be involved in any of this." "Doesn't matter now," Marco said grimly. "Coleman saw your face, and men like Coleman don't leave loose ends." Emily's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered her. Anthony's grip tightened once more, weaker this time, his consciousness slipping. "Non lasciarmi," he murmured. "Don't leave me." "I'm right here," Emily said, pressing her free hand against the wound the way she'd seen in every movie she'd ever watched, praying it was somehow enough. "I'm not going anywhere." Giuseppe took a sharp turn down a side street Emily didn't recognize, weaving through the city with the kind of practiced precision that told her this wasn't the first time he'd driven a wounded man through the dark streets of Chicago, trying to disappear. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere Coleman doesn't know about," Marco said. "A place even most of our own people don't know about." "And what happens to me once we get there?" The silence that followed was worse than any answer could have been. Finally, it was Anthony who spoke, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes closed now, fighting to stay conscious. "Lei resta con me," he said. "She stays with me." Marco's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Nobody argued with Anthony Moretti, not even half dead in the back seat of a car fleeing through the rain. Emily looked down at the blood soaking through the cloth beneath her hands, at the man whose life now depended on words only she could translate, and felt the full, terrifying weight of what had just happened settle over her. 20 minutes ago, she had been carrying bread to a table. Now she was the only person standing between a mafia boss and death, trapped inside a car racing away from a betrayal so deep it had a politician's fingerprints all over it, and she had absolutely no idea what waited for her at the other end of this drive. The car slowed as it approached a set of iron gates hidden behind a wall of trees, the kind of property that didn't show up on any map, the kind of place built specifically for nights like this one. Marco turned to look at her one final time before the gates opened, his expression unreadable. "Whatever you think you know about him," he said quietly, "forget it. Tonight you're not just a waitress who got caught in the wrong room. Tonight, you might be the only reason Anthony Moretti is still breathing tomorrow morning." Emily looked down at Anthony's pale, unconscious face, at the blood on her own hands, and felt something shift inside her chest, something she wouldn't understand until much later, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fact that for the first time in years, she felt like her voice actually mattered. The gates creaked open, and behind them, in the dark, someone was already watching. The gates swallowed the car whole, and the world outside disappeared behind a wall of trees and iron. Emily didn't have time to process the size of the property, the way the headlights swept across a long gravel driveway toward a house that looked more like a fortress than a home. Her hands were still pressed against Anthony's side, slick with blood that had gone from red to a darker, more frightening color. And all she could think was that if he died in this car, in her arms, she would never forgive herself for staying. "He's fading," she said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "Marco, he's fading. Do something." "We're almost there." Marco's knuckles were white on the door handle. "Giuseppe, faster." The car skidded to a stop in front of the house, and before Emily could even unbuckle herself, the door beside her was ripped open by a man she'd never seen before, broad and silent, who lifted Anthony out of the seat like he weighed nothing at all. "Get the doctor!" Marco was shouting now, all pretense of calm gone. "Get Bianchi! Now tell him it's bad!" Emily scrambled out of the car after them, her legs unsteady, her apron still soaked through with someone else's blood. She followed the men through a side door, down a hallway lined with dark wood and old paintings, into a room that had clearly been converted for exactly this purpose. There was a table with restraints she tried not to look at too closely, trays of surgical equipment already being unwrapped by a woman in scrubs, and the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic cutting through the panic in the air. "Everybody out," the woman said, without looking up. She had to be Dr. Bianchi. "Except him." She nodded at Anthony as they laid him on the table. "Everyone else, out, now." "She stays," Anthony rasped, his hand shooting out weakly to grab Emily's wrist before anyone could push her toward the door. "She stays." Bianchi looked up, annoyed. "I don't have time to argue with a man who's about to bleed out on my table." "He won't calm down without her," Marco said through gritted teeth, clearly hating every word coming out of his own mouth. "Trust me, we tried." Bianchi's eyes flicked to Emily, sizing her up in half a second, the way people who worked in emergency rooms learned to do. "Fine, but you stand there, you don't touch anything, and if you faint on the floor, not on my patient. Understood?" "Understood," Emily whispered. What followed was the longest 40 minutes of Emily's life. She stood pressed against the wall while Bianchi worked with terrifying efficiency, cutting away fabric, calling for instruments in short, clipped commands, and every few minutes, when Anthony's body tensed against the pain, breaking through the sedation, he would say something in that broken, desperate dialect, and Bianchi would glance at Emily without breaking her focus on the wound. "What's he saying?" "He's asking if Marco is safe. He keeps asking if everyone made it out." Bianchi's hands didn't stop moving. "Tell him yes. Tell him everyone's fine." Emily leaned closer, her voice gentle in a way she didn't recognize in herself. "Sei al sicuro. Marco sta bene. Tutti stanno bene." "You're safe. Marco is fine. Everyone is fine." Anthony's body relaxed slightly, just enough for Bianchi to keep working, and Emily realized in that moment that her voice, the sound of a language she hadn't spoken since her grandfather's funeral, was the only thing keeping a dangerous man's heart rate from spiraling into something Bianchi couldn't fix. By the time Bianchi finally stepped back, peeling off bloody gloves and exhaling for what looked like the first time in half an hour, Anthony was unconscious but stable, his breathing even, the machine beside the table beeping in a steady, reassuring rhythm. "He'll live," Bianchi said flatly. "Bullet missed anything that mattered. He's lucky, or she's lucky." She nodded toward Emily. Whoever kept him calm enough not to bleed out from panic alone. Marco, who had been pacing outside the door for the entire 40 minutes, finally stepped back in, his eyes immediately going to Anthony's chest, watching it rise and fall, like he needed to see it with his own eyes to believe it. "He's going to be okay," Emily said quietly. Marco didn't look at her right away. When he finally did, his expression wasn't grateful. It was calculating, sharp, the way a man looks at a stranger who suddenly knows far too much. "Come with me," he said. "I should go home. I have a shift tomorrow. My roommate's probably worried. I need to—" "Come with me," Marco repeated, and this time it wasn't a request. He led her down the hallway into a smaller room, a study filled with books that looked like they'd never been read, and a desk that looked like it had seen 100 conversations Emily was better off not knowing about. He shut the door behind them and gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm a waitress. I told you that already." Nobody just happens to understand a dialect from a mountain village in Sicily that maybe 200 people alive still speak, Marco said, his voice low and even, more dangerous than shouting would have been. "So I'm going to ask you again. Who are you, and who sent you?" Emily's temper, buried under hours of fear, finally cracked. "Nobody sent me. I was working my shift, refilling water glasses, and then I heard a man screaming for his life in the only language my grandfather ever used when he was falling apart, and I couldn't just stand there and pretend I didn't understand him. That's it. That's the whole story. I don't know you, I don't know Coleman, I don't know anything about whatever world you people live in, and frankly, I'd like to go back to not knowing." Marco studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight. "You understand what you heard tonight could get you killed." "I'm starting to get that impression, yes." "Coleman is not a man who leaves witnesses," Marco said. "He spent 15 years building a reputation as one of the most trusted men in this city. Tonight, in front of 4 people, you called that reputation a lie. He's not going to forget your face." Emily felt the blood drain from her own face. "So what am I supposed to do? I can't just disappear. I have a life, a rent payment, a roommate who's probably already texting me asking where I am." As if summoned by the thought, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, the vibration loud in the tense silence of the study. Marco's eyes snapped to it immediately. "Don't answer that. It's probably just my roommate. Don't. Answer. That." Emily pulled the phone out anyway, her thumb hovering over the screen. 3 missed calls from Jenna, her roommate, and 1 text that made her stomach twist. "Where are you? Some guy came by asking about you, said he was a friend of a customer from the restaurant. Weird vibe. You good?" She turned the phone around so Marco could see it. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very still, very cold. "That was fast," he muttered. "Fast for what?" "For Coleman to already have someone at your apartment." Marco pulled out his own phone, dialing a number with quick, practiced fingers. "Tommy, I need eyes on an address now." Emily's hands were shaking as she gave Marco her apartment address, every part of her screaming that this couldn't be real, that 12 hours ago her biggest problem had been whether she could afford to fix her car's broken taillight before it got her pulled over. "Jenna's not involved in any of this," Emily said, her voice cracking. "She doesn't know anything. She's not part of your world. She's just my roommate. Please." "Nobody's going to touch your roommate," Marco said, though his voice lacked the certainty Emily desperately needed to hear. "Tommy's good. He'll get eyes on the building before anything happens." "Before anything happens? You don't know that nothing's already happened." Marco didn't answer that, which was somehow worse than if he had. It was nearly 20 minutes later, 20 minutes that felt like 20 years, before Marco's phone buzzed with a return call. Emily watched his face as he listened, trying to read every flicker of expression for good news or bad. "Talk to me," Marco said. Emily couldn't hear the other end of the call, but she watched Marco's shoulders drop half an inch, just enough tension releasing that she allowed herself to breathe again. "Jenna's fine," Marco said, covering the phone with his hand. "Tommy says a man matching Coleman's description of an associate showed up, asked a few questions, left, no threats made directly, but he took a photo of the building." "A photo?" Emily's stomach twisted violently. "Why would he need a photo?" "Because Coleman's not stupid," Marco said grimly. "He's not going to make a move tonight. Not with witnesses everywhere, and his name already whispered in a room full of people who don't trust him anymore. He's establishing what he needs in case he decides he has to act later. In case he decides to what? Kill me? Marco didn't sugarcoat it. Yes. Emily sat down hard in the chair she'd refused to take earlier, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. Everything in her body wanted to scream, to cry, to run out the front door and keep running until she reached somewhere that had never heard the name Anthony Moretti. But another part of her, a part she didn't fully recognize yet, was thinking about the sound of Anthony's voice in that dialect, about the way he'd said, "Don't leave me," like it was the only thing standing between him and total darkness. "I can't go home," she said quietly. "No," Marco agreed. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a while." "And Jenna?" "We'll have someone keep an eye on the building, discreetly. She won't even know it's happening." Emily buried her face in her hands, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel the full, crushing weight of everything that had happened in the last 4 hours. A gunshot. A dying man. A language she thought she'd buried with her grandfather. A politician's cold, calculating smile as he walked out a door, already planning his next move. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why did this have to be me?" Marco was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "You want the truth? I don't know. Maybe it's just bad luck. Wrong shift, wrong table, wrong language buried in your family history." He paused. "Or maybe Anthony's right, and some things happen exactly the way they're supposed to." "What does that mean?" "It means he trusts you," Marco said, like the words tasted strange in his mouth. "And in 20 years, I've watched that man trust maybe 5 people in his entire life. I don't know what to make of that yet, but it means something." Anthony didn't wake for another 2 hours, and when he finally did, it wasn't gently. His eyes snapped open with a sharp, panicked inhale, his body jerking against the restraints Bianchi had left in place as a precaution, his heart monitor spiking into a rapid, frantic beeping that brought both Bianchi and Marco running back into the room. "Anthony, hey, you're safe," Marco said, hands up, trying to calm him. "You're at the house, you're safe. The surgery went fine." But Anthony wasn't looking at Marco. His eyes were scanning the room wildly, searching for something, someone, until they landed on Emily standing near the doorway, and his entire body seemed to sag with relief. "Sei ancora qui," he breathed. "You're still here." "I'm still here," Emily said, stepping closer, though every instinct told her to keep her distance from a man capable of the kind of violence that had put him in this room in the first place. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something raw and unguarded that made it impossible to be afraid of him in this moment. "Coleman," Anthony said, switching to broken English, forcing each word out like it physically hurt. "Where is Coleman?" "Gone," Marco said. "He left the restaurant before we did." Anthony's jaw clenched, and he said something rapid and furious in the dialect, his hand curling into a fist against the sheets. Emily hesitated before translating, glancing at Marco like she was asking permission to say something that clearly wasn't meant to be gentle. "He says Coleman's been feeding information to someone outside the organization for months," Emily said slowly. "He says he suspected it, but he didn't want to believe it. He says the wine was poisoned before it ever reached the table, which means someone inside the restaurant staff was working with Coleman." The room went silent. Marco's face drained of color. "Someone on the inside," he repeated. "At Sorrento's. Someone we trusted enough to be in that private room." Anthony spoke again, more urgently this time, his eyes never leaving Emily's face as she translated, like her voice was the only thread keeping him tethered to the present instead of drowning in fever and fury. "He says there's a shipment," Emily continued, her own voice growing unsteady as she tried to keep up. "Something happening in 3 days. He says if Coleman knows about the shipment, then whoever he's working with will know too. He says—" She paused, her brow furrowing. "He says a name. Petrov." Marco's entire body went rigid. "Petrov," he repeated, like the word itself was dangerous. "Anthony, are you sure? Say it again. Ask him to say it again." Emily leaned closer to Anthony, repeating the question in the dialect, and Anthony's response was immediate, sharp, certain, despite the fever burning behind his eyes. "He's sure," Emily said. "He says Coleman's been working with the Petrov family for over a year. He says that's who ordered the hit tonight, and Coleman was the one who told them exactly when and where to find him alone." Marco turned away from the bed, running a hand through his hair, pacing in a tight, agitated circle. The Petrovs. God, if the Petrovs are involved, this isn't just about tonight. This is about the entire West Side operation. This is about everything we've built for the last decade. "Who are the Petrovs?" Emily asked, immediately regretting the question the second it left her mouth, because the look Marco gave her told her she'd just crossed into territory she really, truly didn't want to understand. "Nobody you need to know about," Marco said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever, if we're lucky." The next several hours blurred together in a haze of hushed conversations, hurried phone calls, and Emily standing at Anthony's bedside, translating fragments of feverish, half-conscious warnings that painted a picture darker than anything she could have imagined 12 hours earlier. A respected city councilman secretly feeding information to a rival criminal organization, a poisoned bottle of wine, a hired shooter. A shipment worth enough money that men were willing to kill each other over the timing of its arrival. Somewhere around dawn, Bianchi finally forced Anthony back under mild sedation, insisting his body needed rest more than it needed answers, and the house fell into an exhausted, uneasy quiet. Emily found herself sitting alone in a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine, a cup of coffee she didn't remember making growing cold in front of her, when Marco walked in and sat down across from her without a word. "You should sleep," he said finally. "I don't think I can." "No," he agreed. "I don't think I could either in your position." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that comes after a night that's rewritten everything you thought you understood about your own life. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Earlier, you said Anthony trusts maybe 5 people in his entire life. What happened to him? Before tonight, I mean. What made him like this?" Marco's expression shifted, something old and tired passing behind his eyes. "That's not my story to tell." "Fair enough. But I'll tell you this much," Marco added, softer than Emily had heard him speak all night. "He had a family once. A wife, a daughter. That dialect you understand, the one that's got half this house terrified because a stranger can suddenly hear everything we don't want heard. That's not just some old village dialect to him. That's the last language his daughter ever spoke to him." Emily's chest tightened. "What happened to them?" Marco's jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. "A fire. 11 years ago. Rival family. Back before Anthony ran things. Back when his father was still in charge. It wasn't even supposed to be their house. Wrong address, wrong night, wrong everything. Anthony wasn't home. He came back to find nothing but ash and 2 names on a headstone he still visits every single week, rain or shine, without exception." Emily thought of her grandfather's funeral, of standing at the edge of a grave listening to a priest speak words she barely understood while her mother wept beside her. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, she understood something about Anthony Moretti that had nothing to do with fear. "That's why he grabbed my wrist," she whispered. "That's why he wouldn't let go." "You sound like her," Marco said quietly. "Not the words, the voice, the way you say things carefully, like you're protecting them. His daughter used to talk like that. He told me once, years ago, drunk out of his mind on the anniversary, that he'd give anything to hear that voice again, even for 5 minutes. Marco looked up, meeting Emily's eyes directly for the first time since they'd sat down. And then a waitress walks into the worst night of his life speaking exactly that voice. You understand why that man isn't going to let you walk out that door easily, no matter how much you want him to. Emily didn't know what to say to that. The coffee in front of her had gone completely cold, and somewhere upstairs, the man responsible for half the fear in this city was sleeping restlessly, still reaching, even unconscious, for a voice that reminded him of everything he'd lost. The peace didn't last long. It was Tommy who burst through the kitchen door just past 7 in the morning, his face pale, his phone still clutched in his hand like he'd run the entire way from wherever he'd been keeping watch. "Marco, we've got a problem." Marco was on his feet instantly. "What kind of problem?" Coleman held a press conference an hour ago, Tommy said, breathless. Said there was an attempted assassination at Sorrento's last night. Said an unidentified organized crime figure was shot during what he's calling a targeted underworld dispute. And get this, he named names. He said the shooter was hired by Anthony Moretti's own organization. He's spinning the whole thing, making it look like Anthony got shot by his own people in some kind of internal power struggle. Emily's stomach dropped. That's insane. That's the opposite of what happened.
Doesn't matter what actually happened, Marco said grimly, already dialing his phone. Matters what the story is before anyone else gets to tell it. Coleman's controlling the narrative before we've even had time to figure out our own next move.
There's more, Tommy said, and something in his voice made Marco go very still.
He mentioned a witness, said there was a restaurant employee who may have information about the shooting. Didn't give a name, but he said police were, quote, actively trying to locate her for questioning. The kitchen went silent. Emily felt the blood drain from her face so fast she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. He's talking about me.
He's not just talking about you, Marco said, his voice tight with fury. He's putting a target on your back and calling it a public safety announcement. Once the police start looking for you, it won't just be Coleman's people watching your apartment. It'll be every reporter, every cop, every curious rival organization in this city, trying to figure out who the mystery witness is. I can't be found, Emily said, panic rising in her throat. If the police question me, if this gets traced back to your family, back to whatever the Petrovs are planning,
you won't be found, Marco said firmly, cutting her off. Not here. Not if we're careful.
And if I go home? If I try to explain to the police that I don't know anything, that I was just working a shift,
then Coleman's people find you before you even finish giving your statement, Marco said bluntly. He's not looking for a witness to clear his name, Emily. He's looking for a witness to silence before she says something that ends his career and exposes his deal with the Petrovs.
Emily sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling so badly she had to clasp them together in her lap. 12 hours ago, she'd been worried about making rent. Now a city councilman had gone on television and effectively announced to half of Chicago's criminal underworld that she existed and needed to be found. This can't be happening, she whispered. It's happening, Marco said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth either. And you need to decide right now whether you're going to run from it or whether you're going to help us stop it before it gets worse. Upstairs, faintly, they heard the sound of a door opening, unsteady footsteps in the hallway, and a moment later Anthony appeared in the kitchen doorway, pale, leaning heavily against the frame, refusing Bianchi's attempts to pull him back to bed. His eyes found Emily immediately, scanning her face for injury, for fear, for anything that told him she was in danger.
Cosa è successo?
He demanded. What happened? Marco quickly relayed everything Tommy had reported, watching Anthony's expression darken with every sentence, his hands curling into fists at his sides despite the visible effort it cost him just to stand upright. When Marco finished, Anthony was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes fixed on Emily with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he said something, low and certain, a sentence that needed no translation for the weight it carried in the room. But Emily translated it anyway, her voice barely above a whisper. He says Coleman just made the biggest mistake of his life, she said. He says nobody threatens someone under his protection and walks away from it. And he says... She hesitated, meeting Anthony's eyes as he waited for her to finish. He says I'm not going anywhere, not until this is finished. The house shifted after that. The exhausted quiet of the early morning replaced by a controlled, purposeful urgency that reminded Emily this wasn't a family sheltering from a storm. This was an organization preparing for war. Marco spent the next hour on the phone with people Emily never saw, his voice dropping into a clipped, businesslike tone she hadn't heard from him before, gathering information, calling in favors, trying to map out exactly how deep Coleman's betrayal ran. Tommy left again, this time to check on Jenna directly, insisting Emily's roommate needed to be moved somewhere safer, without ever understanding why. Bianchi forced Anthony back into a chair, redressing his wound while lecturing him in rapid Italian about the dangers of standing up 8 hours after surgery, a lecture Anthony absorbed with the weary patience of a man who'd clearly heard it before. Emily, meanwhile, sat at the edge of the room, feeling more like a ghost than a person, watching a world she never knew existed reorganize itself around the threat of her own exposure. "You don't have to just sit there," Anthony said quietly, once Bianchi had finally stepped out to prepare more supplies. His English was stronger now, still accented, still careful, but steadier than it had been the night before. "You look like you're waiting to be told you can leave." "Aren't I?" Emily asked. "Isn't that basically what's happening? Everyone deciding what happens to me without actually asking me?" Anthony studied her for a long moment. "You want to be asked." "I want a say in my own life," Emily said, more sharply than she intended. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to understand a dying man's last words. I didn't ask to become a target for a corrupt politician and whoever these Petrov people are. I just wanted to finish my shift and go home." "I know," Anthony said quietly, "and I am sorry for that. Truly." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I will not apologize for asking you to stay, not when staying keeps you alive. And if I want to leave anyway, if I want to take my chances, go to the police myself, tell them everything I know and let them handle it." Something flickered across Anthony's face, not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. "Then I would not stop you," he said. "But I would tell you this. Coleman has spent 15 years buying loyalty inside the police department. Detectives, prosecutors, even a judge or two. If you walk into a police station tonight and tell them what you heard, there is a very real chance your statement never makes it past the front desk before someone makes a phone call. And that phone call would not be to protect you." Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. "So I'm trapped either way." "For now," Anthony said, "but not forever. I promise you that." "Your promises don't mean much to me. I met you 12 hours ago covered in your own blood." To her surprise, something almost like a smile tugged at the corner of Anthony's mouth, faint and tired, but genuine. "Fair," he admitted. "But I keep my promises, Emily. Ask anyone in this house. It is perhaps the only thing men like me have left that means anything." Emily didn't have a response to that. She looked down at her hands, still faintly stained despite having washed them twice, and thought about her grandfather, about the way he used to say that some debts weren't about money, they were about honor, about the kind of loyalty you couldn't buy no matter how much you offered. "Tell me about her," Emily said quietly, surprising herself. "Your daughter." Anthony went very still. "Marco told me a little," Emily admitted. "I'm sorry if that was his to tell or not." For a long moment, Anthony said nothing, and Emily thought she'd overstepped, thought she'd pushed too hard into a wound far deeper than the one Bianchi had just finished stitching. But then he spoke, quietly, in English, like the language itself was a wall he'd built specifically to keep this pain contained. "Her name was Sophia," he said. "She was 7. She used to sing while she did her homework, terribly out of tune, and I would tell her to stop, and she never once listened to me." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I have not heard that dialect spoken by anyone but myself in 11 years, not until last night." Emily's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry." "I know," Anthony said. "I believe you. That is perhaps why I trust you when I should not trust anyone at all." The fragile quiet between them shattered when Marco returned to the kitchen, his face grim in a way that immediately put everyone on edge. "I just got off the phone with someone inside the department," Marco said. "Coleman's not just controlling the story. He's accelerated the timeline. He's pushing for an emergency task force, something he's calling a joint operation between city police and federal agents, using tonight's shooting as justification. He's positioning himself as the reformer who's finally going to bring down organized crime in Chicago. Using an attack that he arranged," Emily said, disbelief and fury tangled together in her voice. "Using an attack he arranged," Marco confirmed. "And here's the part that should scare all of us. If this task force gets approved, if federal agents start digging into Anthony's operation, with Coleman feeding them selective information, they're not just going to find crimes. They're going to find exactly what Coleman wants them to find, framed exactly the way he wants it framed. He's not trying to destroy us with bullets anymore. He's trying to destroy us with headlines and warrants." Anthony's expression darkened, his hands gripping the arms of the chair hard enough that his knuckles went white.
He said something low and furious in the dialect, and Emily didn't need to fully translate it to understand the rage behind it, but she did anyway, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. "He says Coleman spent years building trust just to burn it all in one night," Emily said. "He says a man who would poison a bottle of wine to kill someone in front of witnesses and then twist the story on television before the blood even dries is not a politician anymore. He's something else entirely." "What does he want to do?" Emily asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Marco's eyes flicked toward Anthony, waiting for permission before he spoke, and Anthony gave a small, tired nod. "For now, nothing rash," Marco said. "Anthony's rule has always been the same. You don't fight a war you can't win, and right now, going after Coleman directly, especially with federal eyes about to turn toward us, would be exactly the mistake he's hoping we make. We need proof. Real proof. Something that ties him directly to the Petrovs, to the poison, to the shooting. Something undeniable enough that it doesn't matter how many favors he's called in." "And how exactly do you plan on getting that?" Emily asked. Marco's eyes shifted toward her, something calculating and careful behind them, and for the first time, Emily understood that the question hanging in the air wasn't really about Marco's plan at all. It was about her. "Coleman thinks the witness he's hunting is hiding somewhere terrified, waiting to be found," Marco said slowly. "He doesn't know she's sitting in a kitchen right now, understanding every single word we've said about him for the last 12 hours. Emily's stomach dropped. "No, absolutely not. Whatever you're about to suggest, the answer is no." "I haven't suggested anything yet," Marco said, though the look on his face suggested he already had, and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. Anthony shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at the movement, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. "Nobody will force you into anything," he said quietly. "Not in this house, not while I am alive to say otherwise." "But?" Emily asked, hearing the unspoken word hanging at the end of his sentence. Anthony's expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between gratitude and something that looked almost like guilt. "But we have very little time," he admitted, "and you may be the only person in this entire city that Richard Coleman does not know is watching him." Outside, the morning light had fully broken over the estate, cutting harsh and bright through the kitchen windows, illuminating the exhaustion etched into every face at that table. Emily looked around the room, at Marco's calculating patience, at Tommy's phone still clutched tight with updates on her roommate's safety, at Bianchi hovering in the doorway with a fresh dressing kit, and finally at Anthony, a man who 12 hours ago had been nothing more than a name whispered with fear across the city, now sitting broken and human in front of her, asking without asking for the one thing she never imagined herself capable of giving. "If I do this," Emily said slowly, her voice steadier than she felt, "if I help you get proof against Coleman, I need to know my roommate stays safe. I need to know this ends with him exposed, not with more people bleeding in private dining rooms." "You have my word," Anthony said. "Your word," Emily repeated, and something in her voice was almost bitter. 12 hours ago, your word meant nothing to me. And now? Emily looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had begged in a dead language for her not to leave him, who had shared the name of his daughter like it cost him blood to say it out loud, who had promised without hesitation that no one would force her into anything, even as the entire weight of his organization leaned toward exactly that outcome. "Now," she said quietly, "I think it might mean something after all." Marco exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since Tommy had burst through the door with news of Coleman's press conference. "Then we need a plan," he said, "and we need it fast, because Coleman isn't going to wait around for us to catch up to him." "What kind of plan?" Emily asked. Marco's eyes moved toward the window, toward the city skyline barely visible in the distance, toward a man somewhere out there who believed he'd already won, who thought the only witness against him was a frightened woman hiding somewhere terrified, waiting to be found. "The kind," Marco said grimly, "that Richard Coleman never sees coming." Marco laid a folder on the kitchen table, thin, unmarked, the kind of folder that could ruin a man's entire life if it fell into the right hands. Emily stared at it like it might bite her. "What is that?" "Everything we have on Coleman so far," Marco said, "which isn't much.
financial records that look clean on paper, campaign donations that don't quite add up if you know where to look, a pattern of votes that always seem to benefit certain shipping contracts on the West Side. He tapped the folder. None of it proves anything on its own. It's smoke. We need fire. Anthony, still pale but sitting straighter now than he had an hour earlier, leaned forward despite Bianchi's warning glare from the doorway. Tell her the rest. Marco hesitated, and that hesitation alone made Emily's stomach twist. There's a gala, Marco said finally. 3 nights from now. Coleman's people are calling it a charity fundraiser, but really it's a launch event. He's announcing his campaign for state senate. Half the city's elite will be there. Judges, donors, police brass. A few faces even we don't have names for yet. Okay, Emily said slowly. And Coleman never travels with paperwork, Marco continued. Not on phones, not in emails, nothing that can be subpoenaed or hacked. Everything that matters, every deal, every name, every dollar tied to the Petrovs, it lives in one place. A safe in his private study, inside his house, which happens to back directly onto the same estate where the gala is being held. Emily felt the blood drain from her face as the shape of what Marco was about to ask came into focus. You want me to break into his house? We want you inside the gala, Marco corrected. Nothing more than that at first. You'd be staff, catering. Nobody looks twice at a woman carrying a tray of champagne glasses. You disappear into a room the same way you disappeared into that private dining room 3 nights ago, except this time we control every part of it. And the safe? That's not your job, Marco said firmly. That's mine. You get me inside the building unnoticed. You keep eyes on Coleman so we know exactly where he is at all times, and the second anything goes wrong, you walk straight out the front door and never look back. That's it. That's the whole plan. Emily looked at Anthony, searching his face for the reassurance she desperately needed. But what she found instead was something closer to conflict, a war playing out behind his eyes that he was clearly losing. You don't like this plan, she said. No, Anthony admitted. I do not like this plan at all. Then why are you letting Marco propose it? Anthony's jaw tightened. Because I have spent 3 days trying to think of a better one, and I have found none. Coleman is too careful. He does not make mistakes in public. The only place he is careless enough to keep real evidence is behind the walls of his own home, on a night he believes he has already won. So you're saying yes? I am saying, Anthony corrected, his voice low, that I hate every part of asking you to walk into that house. But I trust Marco with my life, and I trust you with things I have not trusted anyone with in 11 years. If the 2 of you tell me this is the only way, then I will not stand in front of it. But I want it understood by everyone in this room. His eyes swept from Marco to Tommy to Bianchi, landing finally back on Emily. The moment something feels wrong, she leaves. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Her life is worth more than any piece of paper in that safe. Marco nodded once, solemn. Understood. Emily sat with that for a long moment, the weight of being protected by a man capable of terrible things settling strangely in her chest, equal parts unsettling and, if she was honest with herself, something dangerously close to comfort. Okay, she said finally, tell me what I need to do. The next 2 days blurred into something Emily never could have imagined for herself. Marco drilled her on Coleman's schedule, his habits, the layout of his estate pulled from old blueprints and photographs Emily didn't ask too many questions about. Tommy taught her how to move through a crowded room without being remembered, how to carry a tray so that her hands never shook, even when her heart was hammering. Bianchi, of all people, taught her how to apply enough makeup to hide 3 sleepless nights under her eyes, and Anthony watched all of it from a chair he still wasn't supposed to be sitting in, saying very little, his eyes tracking Emily's every movement, like a man committing something precious to memory in case he never saw it again. You don't have to watch, Emily told him on the second night, catching him alone in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. I know, he said. Then why do you? Anthony considered the question for a long moment, turning a glass of water slowly in his hands. Because 3 nights ago, I thought I was going to die on a restaurant floor surrounded by men who could not understand a single word coming out of my mouth, he said. And then I heard your voice, and for the first time since I lost my daughter, I did not feel alone in that language.
I do not know how to explain what that does to a man. I only know that watching you learn to survive my world terrifies me more than facing Coleman myself ever could." Emily sat down across from him, the exhaustion of the last 3 days pressing down on her shoulders. "Can I ask you something honest?" "Always." "Do you actually think this plan will work? Or are we all just pretending we have a chance because the alternative is doing nothing?" Anthony met her eyes without flinching. "I think," he said slowly, "that Coleman has spent 15 years believing no one would ever be foolish enough or brave enough to look for proof inside his own home. I think that arrogance is the only weakness a man like that has left. And I think you are exactly unpredictable enough, exactly invisible enough to people like him, to walk through a door he has never once imagined anyone walking through." "That's not a yes." "No," Anthony admitted, the ghost of a tired smile crossing his face. "It is not. But it is the truth. And I would rather give you truth than false comfort." Emily nodded slowly, something in his honesty settling the frantic edges of her nerves more than any promise could have. "Marco said there's a chance the safe might not even be accessible during the gala," she said. "That Coleman might have added security since the last time anyone mapped that house. Then we adjust," Anthony said simply. "But we do not go in unprepared, and we do not go in without a way out for you that does not depend on anything going perfectly. Nothing in this life ever goes perfectly, Emily. The only thing that matters is having somewhere safe to run when it does not." The morning of the gala arrived faster than Emily was ready for, and by the time Tommy dropped her 3 blocks from Coleman's estate, dressed in the black and white catering uniform Marco had somehow acquired through channels Emily didn't ask about, her hands had gone completely numb with nerves. "Remember," Tommy said, handing her a small earpiece disguised as a simple stud earring, "Marco's on the other end of this the whole time. You see anything wrong, you say the word, and we pull you out. Doesn't matter what stage the plan is at. Doesn't matter what Coleman's doing. You say the word, we move." "What's the word?" "Grandfather," Tommy said. "Anthony picked it. Said it would be the one word you'd never say by accident." Emily's throat tightened at that small, unexpected kindness buried inside a plan built entirely on danger. "Okay." The catering company Marco had infiltrated months ago for exactly this kind of situation moved Emily through the service entrance without a single question asked, folding her into a crew of a dozen other servers, preparing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres in a kitchen buzzing with controlled chaos. Nobody looked twice at her. Nobody had any reason to. It was almost, Emily thought, as she lifted her first tray and stepped through the doors into the main ballroom, exactly like any other shift. Except the man she was watching for tonight wasn't a customer complaining about cold soup. He was a politician standing at the center of a room full of people who trusted him completely, smiling, shaking hands, utterly unaware that somewhere in that crowd, a woman he'd tried to hunt down through the police was standing 8 feet away from him, carrying his champagne. "Eyes on Coleman," Emily murmured into her collar, the earpiece feeding her voice directly to Marco waiting somewhere outside. "He's near the main stage, talking to a group of men in suits. Looks relaxed." "Copy," Marco's voice crackled back, low and steady. "Stay in the crowd. Don't get close enough to be memorable. We just need him occupied while I work." Emily moved through the room exactly as Tommy had taught her, offering trays, refilling glasses, disappearing into the background the way she disappeared into 1,000 shifts at Sorrento's, invisible in the way only service workers ever truly are to the wealthy. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed, donors praising Coleman's vision for the city, a woman in a sequined dress calling him the future of Illinois politics, and each compliment landed in Emily's ears like a small, bitter joke only she understood the punchline to. Then, near the edge of the ballroom, she saw him. Not Coleman. A face she recognized from Sorrento's, one of the line cooks who'd worked the kitchen alongside her for the better part of a year, standing near a side door in a suit that didn't belong to catering staff, speaking quietly into a phone with an expression Emily had never once seen on him during their hundreds of shared shifts. Her blood went cold. "Marco," she whispered, turning her tray slightly, angling her body away from his line of sight. "I think I found our inside man." "Talk to me," Marco said immediately, his voice sharpening through the earpiece. "Danny, From Sorrento's kitchen. He's here, and he's not wearing catering clothes, and he's on the phone looking like he's about to have a heart attack. Emily kept her voice barely above a breath, her eyes fixed on a tray of canapes like her entire world depended on their perfect arrangement. "Marco, this can't be a coincidence." "It's not," Marco said grimly. "Danny's been on our radar for 2 days. We just couldn't confirm it until now. Stay away from him. If he recognizes you, this whole operation falls apart in about 10 seconds. "Too late for that," Emily breathed, panic spiking through her chest as Danny's eyes swept across the room and landed, for one horrifying second, directly on her face. He froze. Emily forced herself to keep moving, to keep her expression perfectly blank, praying that 3 days of exhaustion and makeup had changed her appearance enough that recognition would take a beat longer than instinct. It didn't. "Emily?" Danny's voice cut through the ambient noise of the gala, not loud, but sharp enough that the two people standing nearest him turned their heads. Emily's entire body went rigid. "Say the word." Marco's voice was urgent in her ear now. "Emily, if he's made you, say the word right now." She didn't say it. Not yet. Some instinct, reckless and desperate, told her that running now would confirm every suspicion Danny might have, would turn a moment of uncertain recognition into a certainty that could reach Coleman within minutes. Instead, she turned toward him, forcing a smile onto her face that felt like it might crack the moment it formed. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" Danny's brow furrowed, uncertainty flickering behind his eyes. "You look exactly like a girl I used to work with. Sorrento's, on 5th. "Never worked there," Emily said, her voice steadier than she believed possible, given how violently her heart was slamming against her ribs. "I'm with Holloway Catering, started 2 weeks ago." She lifted her tray slightly, a practiced, casual gesture. "Champagne?" For a moment that stretched into what felt like an entire lifetime, Danny simply stared at her, his phone still pressed to his ear. Whoever was on the other end waiting for an answer, he clearly wasn't giving. Then slowly his expression relaxed. "Sorry, my mistake. You've got a doppelganger somewhere." "Happens more than you'd think," Emily said, already turning away, forcing her legs to carry her at a normal, unhurried pace toward the far side of the room, every nerve in her body screaming to run. The second she rounded a pillar out of Danny's line of sight, she pressed her hand against her chest, trying to steady a heartbeat that felt like it might genuinely give out. "Marco," she whispered, "I need a second." "You did perfectly," Marco's voice said, though the relief in it was unmistakable. "That was close. Too close. I need you to move to the east wing, stay clear of the main floor for the next 10 minutes. Let him lose interest completely before you come back into view." "Copy," Emily breathed, but as she moved toward the east wing exactly as instructed, she caught one more glimpse of Danny across the room, and this time he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his phone, typing something quickly, urgently, his eyes darting up once more toward the crowd before he slipped through a side door and disappeared. Emily's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "Marco, he's texting someone," Emily said, abandoning any pretense of calm. "He just left through a side door near the kitchen. I don't think he bought it. I don't think he bought it at all." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line, and in that silence, Emily could practically hear Marco recalculating every piece of the plan they'd spent 2 days building. "Okay," Marco said finally, his voice clipped and focused. "Change of plan. I need you to get eyes on Coleman one more time, confirm his location, and then get yourself to the service exit near the North Garden. We're accelerating the timeline." "What about the safe?" "I'm already inside," Marco admitted, and Emily's heart nearly stopped at the casual way he delivered information that could get them all killed. "Been in the study for 4 minutes. If Danny just tips someone off, we don't have the luxury of waiting for a better window." Emily forced herself back into the main ballroom, weaving through the crowd with a tray she barely remembered picking back up, her eyes scanning desperately until she found Coleman still standing near the stage, now deep in conversation with a woman Emily recognized from the news as a federal prosecutor. Her blood ran colder. "Marco, he's talking to someone from the DA's office. This isn't just donors and campaign staff anymore. He's got law enforcement in his pocket standing right next to him." "Doesn't change anything on my end," Marco said, though his breathing had grown noticeably tighter, the sound of something being moved carefully in the background. "Almost there. Give me 2 more minutes." 2 minutes in a room full of people who could destroy Emily's entire life with one wrong glance felt like an eternity. She forced herself to keep moving, keep serving, keep breathing normally, even as every instinct in her body screamed to bolt for the nearest exit. She caught snippets of Coleman's conversation as she passed close enough to refill a glass, his voice smooth and practiced, talking about community investment and public safety reform, words that landed like acid in Emily's stomach, given everything she now knew hid behind them. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw 2 men in dark suits enter through the same side door Danny had disappeared through minutes earlier, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with mingling. "Marco," Emily said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "We've got company. 2 men. They just came in the side entrance. They're not guests. They're moving too fast, too focused. Security." "I don't think so. I don't recognize the uniforms." Emily's eyes tracked their path across the room, and her stomach dropped through the floor entirely when she realized exactly where they were headed. "Marco, they're going toward the study. They're going toward you." Silence. "Marco?" "I heard you," Marco said, his voice suddenly very quiet, very controlled in the way people get when panic is a luxury they can't afford. "I need 30 more seconds." "You don't have 30 seconds." "Then I'll take 15, Marco snapped, and Emily heard something that sounded like a lock clicking, followed by the rustle of papers being moved with desperate speed. Emily's mind raced through every option available to her, every scrap of training Tommy had drilled into her over the last 2 days, and landed on the only thing she could think to do. She grabbed a fresh tray of champagne from a passing server's station and walked directly toward the 2 men heading for the study, positioning herself to intercept their path at the exact moment they reached the hallway that led toward Coleman's private wing. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said brightly, stepping directly into their way with the tray extended. "Compliments of Councilman Coleman. He wanted his security team to have a moment to enjoy the evening, too." The 2 men stopped, clearly thrown by the unexpected interruption. The taller one's eyes narrowed slightly. "We're working. We don't need drinks." "Of course, I completely understand," Emily said, keeping her voice light, casual, exactly the tone of someone who had absolutely nothing to hide. "It's just, Danny mentioned you 2 might be heading this way, and he wanted to make sure you knew the hallway's actually closed off right now, some kind of electrical issue they're fixing in the study. He asked me to redirect anyone heading that direction to the East Terrace instead." It was a lie built entirely out of desperation, stitched together in half a second, with nothing but instinct and fear holding it in place. And Emily watched with her heart in her throat as the 2 men exchanged a glance that could have ended everything in an instant. "Electrical issue," the shorter one repeated skeptically. "That's what Danny said," Emily replied, keeping her expression perfectly neutral. "Something about the safe's alarm system tripping a breaker. They didn't want anyone getting hurt poking around in there while it's being sorted. It was a gamble, using the exact detail that could either save the entire operation or destroy it completely, but Emily was banking on one simple truth about men used to giving orders instead of taking them. Nobody wants to be the one who walks into a room during an active electrical problem and explains later why they ignored a direct warning. The taller man's radio crackled at his hip, and for one horrifying second Emily thought it might be Danny, confirming or denying everything she'd just said. But it was only static, a routine check from another part of the property, and in the small window of distraction it provided, the shorter man finally shrugged. "Fine. East Terrace. Whatever." He looked at Emily one more time, something faintly assessing in his gaze that made her skin crawl. "You're new." "Started 2 weeks ago," Emily said, echoing the same lie she'd told Danny minutes earlier, praying it held up under a second round of scrutiny. The men turned and walked away, heading toward the terrace instead of the study, and Emily stood frozen in place for exactly 3 seconds before she felt her knees threaten to buckle beneath her. "Marco," she breathed into her collar the moment they were out of earshot. "You're clear, for now, but I don't know how long that buys us." "You're incredible," Marco's voice came back, breathless with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "I'm out. I've got what I need. Get to the exit now, before Danny finds those 2 and realizes there was no electrical issue." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She moved through the ballroom one final time, forcing herself into the same unhurried, unremarkable pace she'd maintained all night. every step feeling like it took a year off her life. She was 3 feet from the service exit when a hand closed around her arm. Not roughly, not violently, but firm enough that her entire body locked in place. Leaving already? Emily turned to find Richard Coleman standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne, close enough to see the calculating intelligence behind his practiced, charming smile. Her heart stopped. "Just heading back for more supplies," she said, forcing her voice into the exact same light, unbothered tone she'd used on his security team. "We're running low on champagne." Coleman's eyes studied her face for a long, uncomfortable moment, and Emily fought every instinct in her body, screaming to look away, to run, to give away exactly how terrified she actually was. "Have we met?" Coleman asked, his head tilting slightly. "You look familiar." "I get that a lot," Emily said, echoing the same deflection that had worked on Danny, praying it would work twice in one night. "Common face, I guess." Coleman's grip on her arm didn't loosen. "What's your name?" Every instinct told Emily that giving a fake name too quickly, too smoothly, would sound exactly as rehearsed as it actually was. "Sarah," she said instead, letting a small, believable beat of hesitation slip into her voice. The kind of hesitation any nervous new employee might have around a powerful man cornering her by an exit. "Sarah Whitfield. Is there a problem, sir? If service was slow tonight, I can absolutely get my manager." Coleman studied her for one more excruciating second before something in his expression shifted, the sharp edge of suspicion dulling back into the polished, easy charm of a man who had 100 more important things to worry about tonight than a nervous catering employee. No problem," he said finally, releasing her arm. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Sarah." "Thank you, sir. You too." Emily walked through the service exit at a pace that felt like it took every ounce of self-control she had left, and it wasn't until she was 3 blocks away, sitting in the back of Tommy's car, with her whole body shaking uncontrollably, that she allowed herself to fall apart. Hey, you're okay," Tommy said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his voice gentler than Emily had heard it in days. "You're safe. It's over." "He touched my arm," Emily said, her voice cracking. "Coleman. He grabbed my arm and looked right at me, and I thought he knew. I thought it was over. But he didn't," Tommy said firmly. "He let you go." "You did it, Emily. Marco got what he needed. You actually did it." The drive back to the estate felt like it lasted both 10 seconds and 10 years, Emily's mind replaying every close call on an endless, terrifying loop. By the time they pulled through the iron gates, her legs had gone almost completely numb, and she barely registered Tommy helping her out of the car before Anthony was already there, moving faster than a man 3 days out from surgery had any business moving, his hands gentle but urgent as they gripped her shoulders. "Seferita? Are you hurt?" His eyes swept over her frantically, searching for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," Emily managed, though her voice betrayed exactly how not fine she felt. "I'm fine, Anthony, I'm just—" Coleman grabbed my arm. He looked right at me. I thought he recognized me. Anthony's jaw tightened, something dark and furious passing behind his eyes, but his hands remained gentle, careful, like he was afraid too much pressure might shatter something fragile in her that hadn't fully settled yet. "He did not recognize you," Anthony said firmly. "You are here. You are safe. That is what matters." "Marco got it," Tommy said, stepping out of the car behind her. "Whatever was in that safe, he's got it." Anthony's eyes flicked toward the driveway just as Marco's car pulled through the gates behind them, and the moment Marco stepped out, Folder clutched tight against his chest. Something in Anthony's entire posture shifted, years of tension bleeding out of his shoulders all at once. "Tell me it was worth it," Anthony said quietly, his eyes never leaving Emily's face, even as he addressed Marco. "Tell me what she risked tonight was worth it." Marco held up the folder, his expression grim but satisfied. Bank records, wire transfers from a shell company tracing directly back to Viktor Petrov. Emails Coleman apparently thought were safer printed on paper than stored on any server. And, he added, his voice dropping with something close to disbelief, a signed contract.
Coleman agreeing to provide law enforcement blind spots in exchange for a cut of every shipment that crosses through the West Docks. The silence that followed was heavy, complete. The weight of everything they'd just risked finally settling over the group standing in the driveway. "It's real," Emily whispered. "We actually have it." "We have enough to end him," Marco confirmed. "Enough to end all of it, if we're smart about how we use it." Anthony's grip on Emily's shoulders tightened slightly, and when she looked up at him, she found something in his expression she hadn't seen since the night he'd first grabbed her wrist in that private dining room, bleeding and desperate and utterly certain that she was the only person in the world who could save him. Except this time, the desperation was gone. What remained was something quieter, something that looked almost like awe. "You could have run tonight," Anthony said softly, in English this time, like the words needed to be understood, without any possibility of translation getting in the way. "The moment Coleman touched your arm, you could have screamed, could have told him everything, could have ended this entire situation by simply pointing at me and walking away free. Nobody would have blamed you." "I thought about it," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For about half a second, I genuinely considered it." "Why didn't you?" Emily looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had begged her not to leave him in a language that belonged to a daughter he'd buried 11 years ago, at the promise he'd made and somehow, impossibly, kept. "Because you kept your word," she said simply. "And I realized I wanted to keep mine too." But the relief in this driveway didn't last long. Marco's phone buzzed sharply in his pocket, and the moment he checked the screen, his expression shifted into something urgent, something that killed the fragile celebration forming among them. "It's Danny," he said, staring at the screen. "He's calling. Right now." "Don't answer it," Tommy said immediately. "If I don't answer, he knows something's wrong," Marco said, already pressing the phone to his ear before anyone could argue further. "Yeah?" Emily watched Marco's face carefully as he listened, watched the color drain slowly from his expression, watched his free hand curl into a fist at his side. "When?" Marco asked, his voice suddenly very tight. "How long ago?" Silence stretched, as whoever was on the other end kept talking, and Emily felt Anthony's hand find hers, gripping tight, both of them waiting for whatever news was about to detonate across the fragile victory they'd just claimed. Marco finally lowered the phone, his face pale, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. "They found the empty safe," Marco said. "About 10 minutes ago. Coleman knows someone got in." "Does he know who?" Anthony demanded. "Not yet," Marco said. But Danny gave him a description of the new catering girl who redirected his security team away from the study right before it happened. His eyes moved slowly to Emily, and what she saw in them wasn't accusation. It was fear, real and immediate. "Emily, Coleman's putting together the pieces right now. It's only a matter of time before he connects Sarah Whitfield from tonight to the missing waitress from Sorrento's." Emily's blood turned to ice. "How much time?" she whispered. Marco's phone buzzed again, another message this time, and whatever appeared on the screen made his face go even paler than before. "I don't think we have any," he said quietly. "Danny just sent a photo, security footage from the gala. Someone already pulled a still frame of your face, and it's being circulated right now to every one of Coleman's people across the city." Anthony's hand tightened around Emily's, his voice dropping into something low, controlled, but absolutely unshakable. "Then we move faster than they do," he said, "because I did not survive that restaurant, and you did not walk into that gala tonight for either of us to lose everything in the final hour." Behind them, the iron gates that had felt like safety only moments earlier suddenly seemed thinner than paper, and somewhere out there in the dark, sprawling city, Richard Coleman was no longer hunting a nameless witness. He was hunting Emily Carter, by name, by face, and by every resource his 15 years of buried loyalty could still command. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds after Marco said the words. Then everything moved at once. "Inside!" Anthony barked, his voice cutting through the frozen driveway like a blade, all traces of the tired, grateful man from a moment ago gone, replaced by something harder, sharper, a man who had run an empire through instinct, honed over 20 years of exactly this kind of moment. "Everyone inside now." Tommy grabbed Emily's arm,
not roughly, but with the same urgent grip he'd used pulling her out of the ballroom crowd an hour earlier, half guiding, half dragging her toward the house, while Marco barked orders into his phone, already mobilizing whatever resources remained at his disposal at nearly midnight. "They have a photo," Emily said, her voice shaking as they crossed the threshold into the house. "Marco, they have my face. What does that even mean? What happens now?" "It means we stop calling this a precaution and start calling it a lockdown," Marco said grimly, slamming the door behind them and throwing the bolt. "Tommy, get the perimeter cameras up on the main screen. I want eyes on every inch of that fence line." "On it." Bianchi appeared from the hallway, still in her scrubs from redressing Anthony's wound hours earlier, her sharp eyes taking in the chaos instantly. "What happened?" "Coleman's people made her," Anthony said, and something in the flat, controlled way he said it frightened Emily more than shouting ever could have. "They have a photograph. It is circulating." "Circulating to who?" Bianchi demanded. "Everyone who works for him," Marco said. "Which, as of tonight, might as well include half the department and God knows how many of the Petrovs' people, too." Emily's legs finally gave out, not dramatically, just a slow buckling that sent her sinking onto the nearest chair, her hands pressed flat against her knees to keep them from shaking. 3 hours ago, she had been carrying a tray of champagne through a room full of people who wanted to destroy the man she'd somehow ended up protecting. Now her face was a target, printed and passed hand to hand through a network of dangerous men she couldn't even begin to picture. "Jenna," she said suddenly, her head snapping up, "if they're circulating my photo, if they're trying to find out everything about me, how long until they find her? She's my roommate, Marco. She's the first person anyone would ask about." Marco's expression didn't need to answer the question. Emily watched his jaw tighten, watched him glance toward Tommy, who was already halfway to the door before Marco even finished nodding at him. "I'm going," Tommy said. "Right now." "Take Ricci with you," Marco called after him. "2 cars, split routes, in case somebody's already watching the building." Emily stood up so fast, the chair scraped hard against the floor. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Anthony said immediately, stepping into her path. "She's my best friend, Anthony. She has no idea any of this is happening. She doesn't even know I'm alive right now beyond a text I never answered. And if something happens to her because of me, nothing will happen to her," Anthony said, his hands finding her shoulders again, steady despite the chaos surging around them. "Tommy will bring her here, safely. That is not a debate you are having, Emily. That is a promise being kept." "You can't promise that." "I can," Anthony said, and something in his voice left no room for argument. "Because I am done letting people I care about pay the price for decisions that were never theirs to make." The words landed harder than Emily expected, catching somewhere in her chest, and for one brief, strange moment, the fear in the room seemed to still around the weight of what he'd just admitted without fully meaning to. The next 40 minutes crawled by in an agony of waiting that Emily hadn't known was possible to survive. She sat in the study, the same room Marco had questioned her in 3 nights earlier, watching Anthony pace in front of a wall of security monitors, while Bianchi hovered nearby, her medical bag still open on the desk in case the night demanded her skills again, before it was over. "Talk to me," Marco said into his phone every few minutes, his knuckles white where he gripped it. Each time, whatever answer came back only tightened the lines around his eyes further. "They're not answering the buzzer," Marco finally said out loud, lowering the phone slightly, his voice carrying a warning none of them wanted to hear. "Tommy says the apartment lights are on, but nobody's answering." Emily's stomach dropped through the floor. "That doesn't mean anything's wrong. Jenna sleeps like the dead. She probably has headphones in." "Emily." Marco's voice was gentle in a way that made it so much worse. "Tommy's going in." The silence that followed stretched into something unbearable. Emily's hands twisted together so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her eyes fixed on Marco's phone like she could will it to ring through sheer, desperate focus. When it finally buzzed, Marco answered so fast he nearly dropped it. "Talk to me. Talk to me right now." Emily held her breath. "She's fine," Marco said. And the relief that broke across his face nearly buckled Emily's knees a second time, this time from something closer to joy. "She's fine, Emily. She had her headphones in exactly like you said. She had no idea anything was happening." "Oh my God!" Emily's hands flew to her face, a sob of relief she hadn't realized she was holding back, finally breaking loose. "Oh my God, thank you, thank you." "There's more," Marco said, and the careful edge back in his voice made Emily's relief curdle instantly into fresh dread. "Tommy says there were signs somebody had already been there, a door that wasn't locked properly, a window latch that looked tampered with. Whoever Coleman sent to check on her 3 nights ago, they might have come back tonight, and if Jenna hadn't had those headphones in loud enough to sleep through a fire alarm, we might not have gotten to her in time." Emily felt the room tilt slightly, nausea rising fast and sharp. "They tried to get to her. They actually tried to get to her." "We don't know that for certain," Marco said, though the way he said it suggested he believed it completely. "But we're not taking any more chances. Tommy's bringing her here now. She's going to have a lot of questions, and none of them are going to have easy answers." Anthony crossed the room and knelt in front of Emily's chair, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that cut through the panic clouding her thoughts. "She is safe," he said quietly. "That is what matters right now. Everything else we handle as it comes." "How do I explain any of this to her?" Emily whispered. "How do I tell my best friend that the reason someone almost broke into our apartment is because I understood a dying man's last words in a language I hadn't spoken since I was 17? Anthony didn't have an answer for that, and for once, he didn't pretend to. Jenna arrived just before 2 in the morning, and the moment she stepped through the door and saw Emily standing in the entryway of a house that looked like something out of a magazine spread about old money, her face cycled through relief, confusion, and outright panic in the span of about 4 seconds. "Emily, what is going on? Who are these people? Why did some guy just pull me out of our apartment at 1 in the morning and put me in a car with tinted windows?" "Jenna, and why?" Jenna continued, her voice climbing. "Does the news say police are looking for a mystery witness connected to some kind of mafia shooting? And why does that description sound exactly like you? And why haven't you answered a single one of my texts in 3 days?" The room went quiet, every eye turning toward Emily, waiting to see how she would answer a question that had no simple version. "Sit down," Emily said finally, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if I stop, I don't think I'll be able to start again." It took nearly 20 minutes to explain it all. The dinner shift that turned into a nightmare, the dialect she hadn't spoken since her grandfather's funeral, the blood on the restaurant floor, the drive through the rain, the gala, the safe, the folder Marco was even now guarding somewhere in this house like it was worth more than gold. Jenna listened in a silence that grew heavier with every sentence, her face draining of color, her hands gripping the edge of the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. When Emily finally finished, Jenna didn't say anything for a long moment. "You could have died," she said finally, her voice cracking. "Any of those nights. You could have just died, and I would have had no idea why. I would have just gotten a phone call." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth, tears finally spilling over. "I know," Emily said softly, reaching across the table for her hand. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to put you in danger. I never wanted any of this to touch you at all." "But it did," Jenna said. "It already did, Emily. Someone broke a window trying to get into our apartment. I was sleeping 15 feet away." She looked up, her eyes moving past Emily toward Anthony, who stood quietly near the doorway, watching the exchange with an expression Emily couldn't quite read. "Is that him? The man from the news?" "Anthony Moretti," Anthony said, stepping forward, extending a hand with a formality that felt strange given everything happening around them. "I am sorry for what has happened to your home, and I promise you it will not happen again." Jenna looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before finally, hesitantly, shaking it. "You're the reason my best friend's face is being circulated by criminals right now." "Yes," Anthony admitted, without flinching from the accusation. "And I understand if that means you cannot trust a single word I say, but I give you my word regardless. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs me, she will be protected, as will you, for as long as you need to remain here." Jenna studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening slightly despite herself. "You really mean that? I have very little left in this life that means as much to me as keeping promises, Anthony said quietly. It is perhaps the only thing I have left that is entirely mine to give. The fragile calm didn't last. Marco burst into the kitchen just before 3, his phone still pressed to his ear, his expression grim enough that every conversation in the room died instantly. "Say that again," he said into the phone, his eyes flicking toward Anthony. "Say that again slowly." Whatever he heard made his face go rigid. "Understood. Keep me posted." He lowered the phone slowly, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it that night. "What is it?" Anthony said. Not a question, a demand. "That was my contact inside the department," Marco said. "Coleman filed for an emergency warrant an hour ago. He's claiming exigent circumstances, national security implications tied to organized crime, the whole works. He's got a judge lined up to sign off before sunrise." "A warrant for what?" Emily asked, though some sick part of her already suspected the answer. "This property," Marco said grimly. "This house. Coleman's telling the judge he has credible information that a federal witness is being held here against her will, and that evidence tied to an active criminal investigation is being concealed on the premises." Emily's blood ran cold. "He's using me. He's twisting the fact that I'm hiding here into a story about being kidnapped." "It's smart," Marco said bitterly. "It's disgustingly smart. If that warrant goes through, federal agents storm this house within hours, and it won't matter what evidence we have on Coleman anymore. Because the first thing that happens is they find you here, surrounded by armed men, and suddenly you're not a witness who chose to hide. You're a hostage who got rescued, and every word you say afterward gets filtered through exactly the story Coleman's already telling." Anthony's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Then we move the evidence, tonight, before the warrant is signed." "Move it where?" Marco demanded. "Every safe house we have is one Coleman could theoretically know about if his reach inside the department is as deep as tonight suggests. We don't know who else he's bought." "Then we find somewhere he could never think to look," Anthony said, his mind clearly racing through possibilities even as exhaustion and healing wounds pulled visibly at his focus. "Somewhere with no connection to this family, no connection to this house, nothing that appears in any file Coleman has ever touched." The room fell silent as everyone turned the problem over, searching for an answer that didn't exist yet. It was Emily who finally spoke. "My grandfather's old apartment," she said slowly. "It's been sitting empty for 11 years. My mother never sold it, couldn't bring herself to. It's just been paying rent through some property trust nobody remembers exists anymore. Nobody in your world has ever heard of it. Nobody in Coleman's world would have any reason to connect it to me, because I haven't set foot in that building since I was 17 years old." Marco and Anthony exchanged a look, something passing between them that Emily couldn't quite read. "It could work," Marco said slowly. "If the paperwork really is that buried, if there's truly no connection anyone could trace." "There isn't," Emily said. "I promise you there isn't." Anthony's eyes settled on her, something complicated moving behind them. "You would do that? Offer up a place that clearly still means something to you to protect evidence that has nothing to do with your own family?" "It's just an empty apartment," Emily said, though her voice wavered slightly on the words, betraying how much more than that it actually was to her. "And right now, an empty apartment might be the only thing standing between us and Coleman winning this completely." They moved fast after that, faster than Emily thought possible given the hour, given the exhaustion visible on every face in the house. Marco packed the folder into a nondescript bag, along with 2 flash drives Emily hadn't even known existed, copies of everything they'd pulled from the safe, insurance against the possibility that the original documents were somehow lost or seized before they could be used. "I'm coming with you," Emily said, as Marco prepared to leave. "Absolutely not," Marco said immediately, echoing Anthony's exact words from hours earlier. "If that warrant gets signed and agents show up here while you're gone, that actually helps us. It means when they search this house, they find no witness, no evidence, nothing that matches Coleman's story. But if you're spotted anywhere near that apartment building, if anyone connects Emily Carter to that address, we lose the only safe place we have left." "Then let me at least give you directions that make sense," Emily argued. "The building's a maze if you don't know it.
There's a service elevator around the back that doesn't show up on any map. That's the only way in that doesn't put you on camera." Marco hesitated, weighing the risk of bringing her against the risk of navigating unfamiliar territory in the dark with evidence that could end an empire in his hands. "Fine," he said finally, "but you stay in the car. You do not go inside. The second I have this secured, we're gone." Emily nodded, relief and terror tangled together in her chest. Anthony caught her arm gently as she headed toward the door, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Be careful," he said quietly. "Please." "I will." "I mean it, Emily. If anything happens to you tonight because of a decision I allowed, I do not know how I would carry that." Something in the rawness of his voice made Emily pause, made her reach out and press her palm briefly against his chest, feeling the steady, if slightly too fast rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her hand. "You're not the one making my decisions for me," she said softly. "I'm choosing this, just like I chose to walk into that gala, just like I chose to stay in that car 3 nights ago instead of running the second I had the chance." Anthony's hand covered hers where it rested against his chest, and for one brief, suspended moment, the chaos of the night around them seemed to still into something quieter, something neither of them had words for yet. "Go," he said finally, his voice rough, "before I change my mind and lock every door in this house to keep you here." The drive to Emily's grandfather's old building took nearly 40 minutes through streets that had gone eerily quiet in the deep hours of early morning, Marco's eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, checking and rechecking for any sign they were being followed. Emily gave directions in a voice that grew steadily more strained the closer they got, memories flooding back with every familiar street corner, every storefront that hadn't changed in over a decade. "Left here," she said as they turned onto her grandfather's street, her chest tightening at the sight of the old brick building rising up ahead, exactly as she remembered it. Exactly as it had looked the last time she'd stood outside it in a black dress, watching her mother lock the door for what she'd assumed would be the final time. "The service entrance is around back, past the alley." Marco parked the car in shadow, killing the engine, scanning the street one final time before reaching for the bag containing everything that could bring down Richard Coleman's entire empire. "Stay here," he said, "doors locked. If anyone approaches the car who isn't me, you drive. Don't wait. Don't think about it. Just go." "Marco." "I mean it, Emily." She nodded, watching him disappear into the shadowed alley beside the building, and settled into the tense, suffocating silence of waiting alone in a car parked outside a piece of her past she'd never expected to return to under circumstances like this. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, Emily's eyes fixed on the alley entrance, her hand hovering near the door handle exactly the way Marco had instructed. She counted her own heartbeats to keep herself calm, a trick her grandfather had taught her as a child during thunderstorms. "Count until the fear gets smaller, piccola mia. Count until you remember you are safe." She was at 143 when a figure emerged from the shadows near the mouth of the alley. It wasn't Marco. Emily's entire body went rigid, her hand freezing on the door handle, her eyes straining in the darkness to make out details that refused to resolve into anything reassuring. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the parked cars along the street with the kind of methodical patience that belonged to someone searching, not someone passing through. Her phone buzzed in her lap, and she nearly screamed at the sudden noise before realizing it was a text from Marco. "Almost done. 2 more minutes." She typed back with shaking fingers. "Someone's outside, not you, watching the cars." The reply came almost instantly. "Description?" Emily peered through the windshield, trying to make out anything useful in the poor light. "Tall, dark coat, moving slow, like he's looking for something specific. Stay still. Don't move. I'm coming out the front, going to loop around." Emily's heart pounded so hard, she was certain the figure outside could hear it from 30 feet away. She watched him pause beside a car 2 spaces down from where Marco had parked, running a hand along the hood in a gesture that made no sense unless he was checking for warmth, checking to see which vehicles on this quiet street had been driven recently enough that their engines hadn't fully cooled. He was 3 cars away when Emily made a decision that went against every instruction Marco had given her.
She slid down in her seat, pulling her jacket up over her lower face, making herself as small and unremarkable as possible in the dark, praying that stillness would be enough to save her where running might have gotten her caught. The figure paused directly beside Marco's car. Emily held her breath so completely her lungs began to burn. For 3 unbearable seconds, the man simply stood there, close enough that Emily could hear the soft scrape of his shoes against the pavement, close enough that if he leaned down and looked through the window, there would be nowhere left to hide. Then, from somewhere down the street, a car alarm blared to life, sharp and sudden, and the figure's head snapped toward the noise instantly, his entire posture shifting from patient search to immediate investigation. He moved away from Marco's car, walking briskly toward the sound, and Emily didn't dare breathe fully again until he disappeared entirely around the corner. Her phone buzzed again. "Getting in the car now. Go the second I'm in." The driver's door wrenched open seconds later, and Marco slid in behind the wheel, breathing hard, the bag containing the evidence clutched tight against his chest. "Go," he said, jamming the key into the ignition. "Go now." Emily didn't need to be told twice. The car peeled away from the curb, and it wasn't until they were 6 blocks clear, weaving through side streets Marco clearly knew from years of exactly this kind of necessity, that either of them spoke again. "That wasn't one of ours," Marco said finally, his voice tight, his eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors. "And it wasn't police. Police don't check hoods for engine heat like that. That's someone who's done this kind of work for a long time." "Petrov's people," Emily said, the realization settling cold and certain in her stomach. "Has to be," Marco agreed grimly. "Which means Coleman didn't just circulate your photo through his own network. He handed it directly to the people who ordered the hit on Anthony 3 nights ago." Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, nausea rising sharp and immediate. "He's not just trying to protect himself anymore. He's trying to get me killed." "He's trying to get all of us killed," Marco corrected. "You, Anthony, everyone in that house. Because right now, we're the only people on Earth who can prove exactly what he did, and dead witnesses don't testify." The rest of the drive passed in tense, watchful silence, Marco taking a deliberately circuitous route back toward the estate, doubling back twice to confirm they weren't being followed before finally approaching the iron gates that had come to feel, impossibly, like the only safe place left in the entire city. Anthony was waiting in the driveway when they arrived, and the moment the car doors opened, he was moving toward Emily with a speed that betrayed exactly how much fear had been building in him during every minute they'd been gone. "You are all right?" His hands found her face, tilting it gently toward the porch light, searching for any sign of harm. "I'm fine," Emily said, though her voice shook slightly on the words. "But Marco's right. Whoever was watching that car, it wasn't one of Coleman's usual people. It was someone professional, someone who knew exactly what to look for." Anthony's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as Marco relayed the full details of what had happened, the methodical search, the way the figure had checked for engine heat, the precision that spoke of training far beyond ordinary hired muscle. "Petrov's men," Anthony said quietly once Marco finished, echoing Emily's own realization from the car. "He is not simply protecting his investment in Coleman anymore. He is cleaning up loose ends before this becomes a liability he cannot control." "Which means it's not just Emily in danger anymore," Marco said grimly. "It's you too, Anthony. Openly, directly, in a way it hasn't been since the night at the restaurant." Anthony's eyes swept toward the house, toward the windows where Emily knew Jenna and Bianchi were waiting anxiously for news, and something hardened in his expression, a decision crystallizing behind his eyes. "Then we stop hiding from this," he said. "We stop running from house to house, hoping we stay one step ahead of men who have infinite resources and infinite patience. We finish this." "How?" Emily asked. "Marco just told me Coleman's got a warrant coming that'll make this whole house look like a kidnapping. We're barely holding this together as it is." "Then we take away his warrant," Anthony said, his voice gaining strength, gaining certainty with every word. "We do not wait for federal agents to storm this house and twist your story into something it was never meant to be. We go to them first." Marco's eyes widened slightly. "Anthony, if you walk into a federal building—" "Not me," Anthony said. "Emily." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with everything it implied. "What are you talking about?" Emily's voice came out sharper than she intended, fear and confusion tangling together. "You want me to walk into a federal building? After everything we just did to protect the evidence, to protect me? Not to surrender," Anthony clarified quickly, his hands finding her shoulders again, steadying her the way he seemed to instinctively know how to do whenever panic threatened to overtake her. "To testify, on your terms, with a lawyer present, with the evidence Marco just risked his life to secure, before Coleman has the chance to control the narrative any further. You walk in as a witness coming forward voluntarily, not as a victim being rescued from a Mafia stronghold. That distinction changes everything about how your story is heard. You want me to hand over evidence to the same federal system Coleman's been quietly buying favors from for 15 years? Emily's voice climbed with disbelief. "How is that any safer than staying here?" "Because not every federal agent answers to Coleman," Marco said slowly, understanding dawning in his own expression as he considered the plan taking shape. "There's a prosecutor, Dana Whitmore. She's been building a quiet case against West Side corruption for almost 2 years, completely independent of local police, precisely because she doesn't trust the department Coleman's had his hands in for over a decade." "You know her?" Emily asked. "I know of her," Marco said carefully. "She's never taken a dollar from anyone in this life, ours or theirs. She's the one person in this entire city with the authority to move against Coleman and Petrov both, and the credibility to make it stick without anyone being able to claim it was Mafia manipulation." "And if she doesn't believe me?" Emily asked, the question raw with 3 days of accumulated fear. "If she takes one look at where I've been hiding and decides I'm not a credible witness, decides this is exactly the kidnapping story Coleman's already selling?" Anthony was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made the fear in her chest ache differently, more painfully than before. "Then I will tell her myself," he said finally. "Everything. My name, my history, all of it, laid bare in front of a federal prosecutor with no protection, no lawyer softening the truth. If that is what it takes for her to believe you were never a prisoner, never a victim of anything but circumstance and your own courage, then that is a price I am willing to pay." The room went utterly silent. "Anthony," Marco said slowly, "you understand what that means. The moment you speak to a federal prosecutor without immunity, without protection, you're handing them everything they need to end you. Not Coleman, not Petrov, you." "I am aware," Anthony said, his voice steady, despite the enormity of what he was offering. "Why would you do that?" Emily whispered, staring at him like she was seeing him for the first time all over again. "Why would you risk everything, your entire life, just to make sure a prosecutor believes my story?" Anthony's hand rose slowly, cupping her face with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with everything Emily had learned about the man he was supposed to be. "Because 11 years ago," he said quietly, "I lost the only 2 people who ever made me feel like the man I was, instead of the man this life demanded I become. I could not save them. I have spent every day since believing that failure was something I would carry until I died." His voice cracked slightly, raw in a way Emily had never heard from him before. "You walked into a room 3 nights ago and gave me a voice I thought I would never hear again in this world. You have already given me more than I have any right to ask for. Let me give you this. Let me finally do something with what is left of this life that is not simply about survival." Emily's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother trying to hide. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we go to Whitmore, together." Marco was already moving toward his phone, dialing a number with the careful precision of a man about to gamble everything on a single conversation, when the house's security system let out a sharp, piercing alarm that sent everyone in the room lurching upright. "What is that?" Emily gasped, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Perimeter breach!" Tommy shouted from the hallway, already sprinting toward the security monitors, his face going pale as he stared at the screens. "East fence line, multiple bodies, moving fast." Anthony's expression transformed instantly, 20 years of survival instinct snapping into place. "How many?" "I count 6, Tommy said, his voice tight. "Maybe more coming through the tree line. Hard to tell in the dark." "Petrov," Marco breathed, his phone forgotten in his hand. They didn't wait for morning. They didn't wait for anything.
Anthony was already moving, pulling Emily behind him toward the interior of the house, even as pain from his healing wound visibly tore through his side with every hurried step. "Bianchi, get Jenna into the safe room downstairs, now. Marco, get that evidence somewhere no one can reach it if this house is breached. Tommy." "On it," Tommy said, already pulling a weapon from a hidden compartment near the security panel. His earlier easy warmth replaced entirely by something cold and focused. "Anthony, what's happening?" Emily's voice shook as he pulled her along the hallway, his grip on her hand almost painfully tight. "Are they coming for the evidence, or are they coming for you?" Anthony said grimly, not slowing his pace. "For me. For everyone in this house who can connect Coleman to what happened 3 nights ago. This is not a robbery, Emily. This is an extermination." The words landed like a physical blow, and Emily's legs nearly gave out beneath her as the true, terrifying scope of the night finally crystallized in her mind. Somewhere outside, in the darkness beyond the iron gates that had felt like safety only hours earlier, armed men were closing in on a house that held every piece of evidence capable of ending Richard Coleman's career, and every person who could testify to how it had been obtained. "There's a passage," Anthony said suddenly, stopping in front of what looked like an ordinary bookshelf in the study, his hands moving with practiced speed along its edge until something clicked and the entire shelf shifted inward, revealing a narrow, dark stairwell descending beneath the house. "My father built this decades ago. Almost no one alive knows it exists." "Anthony." "Go," he said, pressing her toward the opening, his voice fracturing slightly around the edges of forced calm. "Bianchi will bring Jenna to you. Stay down there, stay quiet, and do not come out until Marco or I come to get you personally. Do you understand me?" "What about you?" Emily's hands gripped the front of his shirt, panic overriding every instinct toward obedience. "You're still healing, Anthony. You can barely stand upright. You can't be out there." "I built this house," Anthony said, his hand cupping her face one final time, his eyes burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "I know every inch of it better than the men trying to take it from me. I will not lose this fight, Emily. Not tonight. Not after everything you have already risked to get us this close." From somewhere upstairs, the sharp, unmistakable crack of gunfire shattered through the house, followed immediately by Tommy's voice shouting something urgent and furious that Emily couldn't fully make out over the sudden, roaring pulse of her own heartbeat. "Go," Anthony said again, more urgently this time, already turning away from her toward the sound of the fight breaking out above them. "Now, Emily, please." She stumbled backward into the dark stairwell, watching the bookshelf swing shut behind her, sealing her into a darkness so complete she could hear nothing but her own ragged breathing and the muffled, terrifying sounds of violence erupting somewhere above her head. Somewhere up there, Anthony Moretti, a man who had begged her not to leave him 3 nights ago, in a language belonging to a daughter he'd buried 11 years earlier, was walking straight into gunfire to buy her the time to survive a night neither of them had ever asked for. And in the suffocating darkness of that hidden stairwell, all Emily Carter could do was wait and pray and hope that the promise he'd made her, the one he'd sworn he would never break, wasn't about to become the first one he couldn't keep. The gunfire lasted 11 minutes. To Emily, crouched in the suffocating dark of a stairwell built by a dead man's hands, it lasted an entire lifetime. She counted her own heartbeats the way her grandfather taught her. Count until the fear gets smaller, but the fear never got smaller. It only got louder, matching each distant crack of gunfire with a fresh wave of terror that Anthony was somewhere above her, wounded, exposed, walking toward danger instead of away from it. Jenna found her in this dark eventually, Bianchi guiding her down through the hidden passage with a flashlight and a steadiness that Emily would later learn came from years of nights exactly like this one. The 2 women sat pressed together against the cold stone wall, hands locked, neither of them speaking, both of them listening to a war they couldn't see and couldn't stop. Then silence. Silence that stretched so long and so completely that Emily began to believe it was worse than the gunfire had been, because gunfire at least meant someone was still fighting. When the bookshelf finally groaned open above them, Emily's entire body flooded with a fear so sharp it nearly stopped her heart, certain in that instant that whoever stood in the doorway would not be a face she wanted to see. It was Marco,
Blood on his sleeve, not his own. Exhaustion carved into every line of his face, but alive, standing, breathing. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's over, Emily. Come up." She didn't remember climbing the stairs. She only remembered finding Anthony standing in the hallway upstairs, favoring his injured side heavily, a fresh cut above his eyebrow, but upright, breathing, alive, and the sound that came out of her when she saw him wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite his name, just something raw and wordless that carried every hour of terror from that stairwell straight into his arms. He caught her like he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly this, his arms wrapping around her so tightly it nearly stole what little breath she had left. "Say salva," he whispered into her hair, over and over, like the words themselves were the only thing keeping his own hands from shaking. "You're safe. You're safe. You're safe." What followed in the weeks after that night unfolded the way real endings usually do. Not with fireworks, but with paperwork, testimony, and the slow, grinding weight of truth finally being allowed to breathe. Emily sat across from Dana Whitmore 3 days later, a folder of evidence between them that took nearly 6 hours to fully explain, Anthony beside her exactly as he'd promised, offering his own name and history with a steadiness that left the prosecutor visibly stunned. Richard Coleman was arrested 11 days after that, quietly, without cameras, in the driveway of the same estate where he'd announced his campaign for higher office. The Petrov network unraveled slower, piece by piece, but it unraveled, and within 4 months, the name that had once made grown men flinch across half of Chicago belonged to a man in a courtroom instead of a headline of fear. Anthony never went back to the life he'd built before that night. He couldn't. Too much had been exposed, too many names had surfaced in the evidence Marco carried out of that safe, and though Anthony was never charged with anything Coleman's collapse hadn't already implicated him in tangentially, he chose, deliberately and without regret, to walk away from all of it. "I do not know how to be anything else," he admitted to Emily one evening, months later, sitting across from her in the small kitchen behind the restaurant he'd promised her, the one that had, against every reasonable expectation, become exactly the future she'd once believed was impossible for a woman counting rent money in an apron pocket. "You don't have to know yet," Emily told him. "You just have to be willing to learn." It would be easy to end this story there, with a courtroom victory and a quiet restaurant kitchen and 2 people who survived something that should have destroyed them both. But the real ending of this story isn't really about a mafia boss or a corrupt politician, or even the courage it took a tired waitress to translate a dying man's final words. It's about what happens when someone finally sees you. Not the version of you that fits neatly into a job title or a bank balance, or the role the world assigned you the day you were born into it. Not the waitress who refills water glasses and disappears into the background the way service workers are trained to disappear. Not the feared boss whose name alone was enough to make grown men lower their eyes. Emily Carter had spent her entire adult life being overlooked, not mistreated, not particularly, just unseen, the way so many people who work quietly and carry more than anyone realizes are unseen every single day, invisible in restaurants and offices and grocery store lines all across this country, holding entire lives together on the strength of exhaustion nobody bothers to ask about. And Anthony Moretti had spent 11 years being feared instead of known. People flinched from his name before they ever learned a single true thing about the man attached to it. His power made him powerful. It never once made him understood. What happened between them in that private dining room wasn't romance, not at first, not even close. It was recognition. It was one broken, grieving person hearing another broken, grieving person speak a language that belonged to loss, and choosing, in the space of a single, terrified heartbeat, not to look away. That is what love actually is, if you strip away everything Hollywood and greeting cards have convinced us it should look like. Love isn't the grand gesture. It isn't the perfect timing or the flawless first meeting. Love, real love, the kind that survives gunfire and betrayal and 11 years of buried grief, begins the moment someone chooses to see you exactly as you are, in your worst, most frightened, most unguarded moment, and stays anyway. Anthony didn't fall for Emily because she was beautiful, though she was. He didn't fall for her because she was brave, though God knows she proved that a dozen times over before this story was finished. He fell for her because for the first time in over a decade, someone looked at him bleeding on a floor, surrounded by fear and power and violence, and instead of seeing a monster, she heard a grieving father calling out in the only language his daughter ever knew. And Emily didn't stay because he was powerful. Power had never impressed her, not once, not for a single second across this entire ordeal. She stayed because a dangerous, feared, broken man looked at her, a woman most of that world would have stepped over without a second glance, and treated her voice as the most important sound in the room. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth buried underneath every mafia thriller and every headline about corruption and betrayal. The people who change our lives most completely are rarely the ones who arrive with fanfare. They are the ones who show up in our worst moments, who hear the parts of us we thought no one would ever understand again, and who choose deliberately again and again to stay. Love built on convenience collapses at the first sign of difficulty. Love built on witnessing someone's truth, on staying present through their worst night instead of their best day. That kind of love has roots deep enough to survive almost anything, because it was never built on the easy parts to begin with. There is a version of this story where Emily Carter walks out of that private dining room the moment she hears Anthony speaking, minds her own business, finishes her shift, goes home to an ordinary, uncomplicated life. Nobody would have blamed her. Most people, if they are honest with themselves, would have made exactly that choice, and there is no shame in that instinct. Self-preservation is not a character flaw. But something in her recognized something in him before either of them understood what that recognition would eventually cost, or eventually give them both. And maybe that's the real lesson, sitting quietly underneath everything that happened between a waitress and a mafia boss in a private dining room in Chicago. We spend so much of our lives believing that love requires two people who already have everything figured out. Two whole people meeting at exactly the right moment in exactly the right circumstances. But real love, the kind that actually endures, usually finds two broken people in the middle of their worst chapter and asks nothing more of them than honesty. Anthony gave Emily his name, his history, his grief, laid bare in front of a federal prosecutor with nothing held back, because he understood that love without honesty is simply performance. And he had spent 11 years performing strength for a world that never once asked whether he was actually all right. Emily gave Anthony something he hadn't received from another living soul in over a decade. She gave him permission to be afraid, to be human, to grieve out loud in a language that had been locked away with a grave he visited every single week, rain or shine. Neither of them set out looking for that. Nobody ever does. The people who matter most rarely arrive on schedule, dressed the way we expected, in circumstances that make any sense at all. Sometimes they arrive bleeding through an expensive suit, speaking words nobody else in the room can understand, and the only thing standing between chaos and connection is whether somebody, anybody, is brave enough to step forward and say, "I understand you, I hear you, you are not alone in this." Years from now, when people tell this story, they will probably remember the mafia boss, the corrupt politician, the gunfire in a hidden stairwell beneath an old estate. That's the part that makes for a dramatic headline, the part that fills 2 hours of a story worth telling. But if you ask Emily Carter what she actually remembers most from that night, she won't talk about danger. She'll talk about the exact moment a dying, frightened man's hand found hers and refused to let go, not because he needed a translator, but because for the first time in 11 years, somebody's voice made him feel like his daughter hadn't entirely left this world after all. And if you ask Anthony Moretti, a man once feared across an entire city, what changed him most completely, he won't talk about the empire he walked away from, or the war he survived, or even the justice finally served to the men who betrayed him. He'll tell you it was a waitress who never should have understood a single word he said that night, who had every reason in the world to walk away and chose, instead, to stay. That's the whole story, really. Underneath all the noise and danger and betrayal, love doesn't ask if you're powerful. It doesn't ask if you're perfect, or if your circumstances make sense, or if the timing is convenient. Love simply asks one question, quietly, in whatever language your heart still remembers. Will you understand me? Will you stay, even now, even like this? And somewhere in every one of us, whether we're the feared man at the head of the table or the tired woman clearing plates, nobody bothers to look at twice. There is a small, hopeful part waiting for someone brave enough to answer yes.